Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is a co-hosted webinar brought to you by Mailgun and Ongage. My name is Danny Tal and I'm a VP Business Development at Ongage, and with me today is Nick Schafer, Technical Account Manager and Deliverability Expert from Mailgun. Hi Nick.
Hi everyone, good to be here.
All right, so today's topic is Email Best Practice 2018. So that's a pretty big topic. We've got about 40 minutes to cover everything. So the plan is really to kind of walk you through the fundamental aspects of delivery from lead collection, list hygiene, blacklists, authentication protocols, and more. And hopefully we'll be able to provide you some takeaways, and it's going to be cool and interesting. And just before I hand it over to Nick, I want to give you guys a quick overview about Ongage and Mailgun and pretty much how we work together. So Mailgun is the leading SMTP relay in the market today, focused on high-performance email delivery. And essentially, their job is to deliver your emails and make sure that they're hitting the inbox and avoiding the spam filters. Ongage is a standalone email marketing platform, and we deal with anything from list and campaign management, analytics, automation, segmentation, and more. And I guess the synergy between Ongage and Mailgun is pretty clear. They deal with delivery. Ongage is the campaign management tool, and together we bring a full ESP solution. So without further ado, over to you, Nick. And just want to point out that this session is being recorded and we'll send it out to everyone, so no need to take notes. All right, it's on you, Nick. Thanks.
All right, thanks for the intro, Danny. Yeah, as he mentioned, I'm a technical account manager here at Mailgun. And one of the things I can kind of really try to focus on is the deliverability side of things and making sure our customers are following best practices. So in this presentation, we'll cover some of those practices. Some of them you may have heard before, some of them may be new. So hopefully, what we show today will give you something to, put into effect with your 2018 email campaigns. All right, so first we want to kind of start off with, getting set up for success before you're actually doing any kind of sending of email. This is really important. I know a lot of people want to just kind of get in and get started sending, but there's a lot of things that really kind of need to be addressed beforehand. Some of these are who is and DNS. So that's what we're going to discuss on this first slide. Whenever I'm talking about who is, really, kind of what I want to touch on is that a common tactic for abusive senders is to hide their identity behind an anonymized domain registration. Really, legitimate senders have no need to do this. You should be able to make that information readily available. So in case like a recipient mail server or mailbox provider needs to reach out to you, they can without facing a anonymized domain registration. I know you can set up privacy whenever you register a domain. So our recommendation is to avoid doing that. Make stuff clear and available to customers. The next topic related to DNS is if you are currently using a dedicated IP with Mailgun, you should look into getting reverse DNS and forward records set up for your IPs. This is really helpful because it makes it easy for mail providers, mailbox providers, recipient servers, whoever, to kind of make it easy to know who is the customer sending messages to them. They'll see it in the SMTP chat. So it's really kind of important, and it lets them know who the message is coming from without them having to do guesswork. Another thing regarding this is make sure the domain you are sending from actually resolves to a domain. Think of how it looks to an ISP when a domain sending messages doesn't exist. Really, the key here is just, it's all about perception and what you look like. You don't want to look like a spammer. So make everything as clear as possible. Use a domain that has a website. You can use subdomains. The subdomain doesn't necessarily have to have a website, but as long as the root domain does, it should be clear. So in terms of DNS records, we require SPF and DKIM records before you can even start sending messages through Mailgun. It's required for verification purposes. We won't touch on it too much here. There's a lot of documentation on our site about it. Basically, SPF allows domain owners to specify which mail servers are allowed to send email on behalf of the domain they're sending from. One important thing to note though about this is that the SPF record for the domain, what recipient servers check is the return path domain, not the friendly from that everyone sees in their mailbox. So this is important because it still allows people to spoof your domain. It's kind of one of the downfalls of SPF in my mind. But in general, having those records set up makes your domain look less appetizing to spammers. So make sure you get that set up along with DKIM. DKIM, kind of the same boat, a little different as it deals with cryptography. Messages are signed with a DKIM key, and recipient servers then decrypt that key to make sure messages haven't been altered in transit. Kind of the next record we're going to talk about here is something that kind of brings the two together. That's DMARC. I know a lot of y'all have probably heard about it. It hasn't been widely adopted yet, and I'm hoping that DMARC kind of takes a more adopted approach in 2018. And I'll kind of give you some reasons, why I think it's beneficial for you to set them up. So DKIM, or DMARC, like I said, takes both SPF and DKIM into account. But the big thing that sets DMARC apart is domain alignment and reporting. DMARC is the first authentication standard to address the friendly from address that we spoke about. So this is helping to tackle spoofing of messages, which SPF and DKIM don't really address. So it does this by making sure that the domain used in the friendly from aligns with the domain used in the return path for SPF purposes and the D equals domain portion for DKIM. DMARC can still pass if only one of SPF or DKIM align. But what we recommend is, if you get this set up, to make sure that both align, both SPF and DKIM align with the friendly from, so DMARC can pass. Another cool thing about DMARC is it provides insight into your mail traffic and possible problems with people trying to maliciously use your domain. They do this by sending aggregate reports back to you. Mailbox providers will do this, and you can basically look to see if your messages are authenticating properly, and if there are messages that aren't, you can kind of identify if it's something malicious, or maybe your own brand is sending out messages that aren't properly authenticated. With DMARC as well, you have the option to provide a policy. This basically tells mailbox providers what to do with messages that are DMARC signed. You have three options. You can set your policy to none, quarantine, or reject. To start, always use none, so you can just kind of get those reports and make sure all of your traffic's being authenticated properly. Once you have determined that everything is being authenticated properly, you can move on to quarantine and then reject, so that mailbox providers can reject messages that aren't properly signed. Like I said, DMARC hasn't been widely adopted yet. I'm really hoping that in 2018, more and more senders start to get those set up, because most mailbox providers do check for this, and I believe that it will help in the long run with deliverability, especially if you have people trying to spoof your domain. Michael just asked if DMARC helps deliverability today. That's a good question. I've actually attended some different conferences like MOG, and this question comes up every time. Really, the answer is not directly. As far as we all know, it doesn't directly improve deliverability, but what it does do is it protects you from malicious users. So indirectly, yes, it can help with deliverability. If you prevent people from spoofing your domain, then your reputation will be golden. Thomas asked about DMARC providing reports and if we have examples. Don't currently have any examples, but that's definitely something that we can follow up on. There's a lot of examples of this online. One website that I really like to look at is DMartian. It's a really good one. MX Toolbox as well, as others have mentioned. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on to the next section. The do's and don'ts of list acquisition. This is really important. List acquisition, I think, is kind of the lifeline of your health as an email sender. You want to make sure that addresses that are coming into your mailing list are actual legitimate email addresses, and no one's providing phony addresses or anything like that, or disposable email addresses, things of that nature. So we'll touch on kind of the do's and don'ts. First and foremost, confirmed opt-in. You probably heard it called double opt-in. It's really important. It verifies that an opt-in request did in fact come from the owner of the email address and was therefore not spoofed, forged, typoed, or otherwise fraudulently subscribed. I hear all the time that customers think it impedes the user experience, but I don't believe it does that. I think it's, at this day and age, I think it's expected whenever you sign up on a website, to get that confirmation message. So always use double opt-in if possible. The next do is CAPTCHA. And what I'm talking about here is specifically related to your sign-up forms. If your sign-up form isn't protected with CAPTCHA, it's a sitting duck for malicious entities out there. Specifically, talking about kind of mail bombing. If you haven't heard of that, mail bombing is something where bots basically crawl the internet looking for unsecure sign-up forms. And once those bots have identified all these sign-up forms, they can basically go through and sign up a single address for thousands of email addresses or for thousands of websites. What happens then is that user's mailbox gets flooded with messages, and this causes a problem. And Spamhaus has addressed this by actually listing IP addresses that show characteristics of this. So it's really important to make sure you protect your forms. The next do is validate email addresses. This is something that Mailgun can actually help with directly with the use of our email validation API. User submits an email address into the form. Oftentimes they'll fat finger it and put a typo in there. Our email validation can work seamlessly with your sign-up form, and we'll basically confirm addresses. If they put a typo in there, we'll even show a "did you mean" address. So it kind of helps to make sure you're getting legitimate email addresses. And recently, our validation service got an upgrade a few months ago, where we're actually doing callback verification. So we're checking actual validity of email addresses at the gateway. The next do is capture user preferences. What I really like whenever I'm signing up for websites is them asking for preferences, like, how often do I want to receive messages? Do I want to receive, just monthly or weekly or even daily? Anytime you can capture that information, it's really valuable to understand your user base. That's gonna, reduce the amount of complaints and unsubscribes you're gonna get. The next do is prompt the user with what to expect. Something that I've seen that really helps is, whenever a customer signs up on a website, you give them a little pop-up said, "Hey, we're sending a confirmation message. Check your mailbox." And check your spam folder or other folders just to make sure if that message did happen to get filtered, they know to go in and look for it. This helps train mailbox providers, filters. If a large number of people are moving messages and saying not spam, then they were inadvertently filtering those messages. So anytime you can show that information to the customer to show them what to expect, it's really helpful. They can even add, your from address to their, safe sender list or contacts list. Now for the don'ts. This first one, I'm sure you've heard thousands of times. I've told customers this over and over and over, and still to this day, we see customers do it. Yeah, it's a quick way to get, a large email list, but those users never, opted in and gave permission for you to send them messages. And more often than not, spam traps are found in large quantities in those lists that you can find online. So stay away from them at all costs. The next one is scrape or harvest. Kind of goes hand in hand. These users didn't give you permission, so don't go across the internet and scrape websites for email addresses that are found. Chances are people will plant spam trap addresses on hidden forms. So the same thing, blacklists can happen and do happen. The next one is email append. Not sure if everyone knows what this means, but to kind of give some clarity to the subject, basically what this means is, say you have information related to a customer, but you don't have their email address. You can use services and find that customer's email address based off of the data you do have. They didn't give you permission to email them though. So this is a bad practice. Spamhaus has a write-up on this, and MOG, the Message Anti-Abuse Working Group, actually has a document that specifically discusses this practice and how bad it is. The next don't is don't deceive users. Make it clear what they're doing, like what they're signing up for, if they're gonna receive messages. Something that I wanna touch on here is don't check the receive promotional messages automatically. You want the customer to explicitly, check that box, because if they didn't, you didn't get permission from them. That kind of goes with the next bullet point. Don't ever assume permission. You want explicit permission from the recipients. If you don't get that, chances are you might get complaints, which will drive down your reputation and directly impact your deliverability. All right, so Thomas asked, what would be the best practice with company acquisition? Can the acquired mailing database be used somehow? That's a really good question. Generally, what I kind of recommend to customers is to send out an email notifying the customers of the acquisition, and maybe even do a reconfirmation, just to make sure that the customer understands that it's a new company, and make sure that they still want to receive them. That's how I would approach that, Thomas. That's a good question. All right, so list hygiene is the next subject that we're going to talk about. Like Willy Wonka's saying here, set it and forget it, you say. How's that working out for you? It's always important to not just send messages and do nothing after the fact. You always want to know kind of what's going on. One interesting aspect of list hygiene is something that I work really closely with our managed customers as a technical account manager here at Mailgun, is to really understand what your users are doing, understanding the engaged users and the unengaged users. A good case study related to this is we had a customer that had severe problems with deliverability. They were getting messages filtered across the board by most mailbox providers. I worked with them to kind of target those engaged users. We had data to go off of. We had users that were still opening messages, so we targeted those users and did some other things like adopting a sunset policy, which we'll touch on in a second, and just clearing up all the unengaged. And when we were done with that, that user had a 40% open rate and higher. So it definitely is something that mailbox providers want to see. They want to see senders paying attention to user engagement, because that's in my opinion the number one driver of what impacts reputation. As far as tracking engagement analytics, there's a bunch of data that you can use to understand this. For Mailgun purposes, you need to use our open and click tracking to get a hold of this data, so that you can see when users are opening and clicking. Same thing for Ongage. They have that enabled by default, so we feed that data back to them, and they have a good understanding. And from there, you can keep an eye on your stats, track bounces, complaints, and unsubscribes, and make sure your list is as healthy as possible. Mailgun does track bounces, complaints, and unsubscribes for you. One thing that I kind of always recommend is to not just leave it at us suppressing them, but actually cleaning up your list of those users, so you can kind of remove those suppressed users, just to have a 100% healthy list. Yes, we'll suppress those messages anyways, but it's always good to see more accurate information. You don't have those suppressions in your data analytics. As far as like boosting engagement, like I touched on, mailbox providers want to see high engagement. That's what is going to determine if they're sending messages to the inbox or the spam folder. Target those engaged users and run re-engagement campaigns. Re-engagement campaigns are really important for the unengaged. So if there are users that haven't opened in a while, run a re-engagement campaign to kind of entice them. Give them a good offer to see if you can get them back engaged. That's something that's really helpful. You can improve your overall list health. If those users still don't kind of engage with those messages, and maybe it's time to consider removing them from your list, which we'll kind of touch on this next slide. The sunset policy is something that I really think is huge. I see it time and time again where our customers have recipients that haven't done anything with a message in years, and they're still sending to them. That's just you're hurting yourself. Whenever you send a message to a recipient that isn't doing anything, that's driving down your engagement metrics with different mailbox providers. They see that, they'll start filtering. One thing I kind of recommend, these numbers aren't exactly set in stone. Different use cases can come into play here, so kind of play around with it and find what works for you. But in general, like if you're sending daily messages, start to look at this engagement after like a week. I mean, maybe that user gave a bad address or something. So if you're getting nothing from them, don't continue to send from them. If you're sending weekly messages, you can extend that out further, 30 days, 60 days, whatever. If you're only sending occasional messages, like a monthly newsletter, then you can extend that further out, 6 months to a year. It's just really important to keep an eye on those users, as they only drag down your engagement metrics, which as I mentioned, is kind of the driver of deliverability. All right, so Mac asked, I have a list of 2 that has around 60% open rates, but hovers around 3% click-throughs. I have no idea why. Any ideas? Click-through rates are actually much lower, than open rates. Open rates is, I think the best indication of, deliverability. As long as, the users are opening messages, chances are, those messages are getting through, to the user's inbox so that they can, read the message and see if it's something that, they want to take further action on. So in terms of, driving up that click-through rate, take a look at maybe the offers that you are proposing to the customer. Make sure that the call to action is clear so that you can get your recipient through to your website. I believe there's a slide here coming up that kind of talks about that. Let's see, there's 2 questions actually from Tammy. The first one was, we do clean new data that is coming into the system, but how often should you clean your lists that you are sending daily? When you're sending daily messages, like I said, with the sunset policy, cut that period back, put it, more around like a week, if not further. If you're still having issues though, test it, see, run, maybe some users, clean it after, 3 days, clean it after 5 days, just test it out, see if performance increases and kind of go from there. It's a lot of tinkering, trial and error. Tammy also asked, we do that through the segment section to exclude, but should we also be cleaning the sending list as well every month or so? Yeah, I absolutely recommend, taking a look at your data holistically, like every month, and seeing if there's, anything that you can clean up. Users that are triggering opens or clicks because of some kind of, software that they have. So just kind of, keep an eye on those things. And I recommend, every month, take a good look at your data. All right, so now on to the next section, content. I'm sure you all have read a lot of articles around content. So some of this, it may be familiar. Maybe some of it's new. I hope so, so that you get something out of this section. The from address. I see it time and time again where users are constantly using no reply. One of the big things that, I've actually sat down and talked with, mailbox provider representatives at conferences is, how can we get better delivery? And they're always talking about interaction. They want people to interact with the messages that senders are sending. So if you're saying no reply, that's just deterring interaction altogether. So use something a little more friendly. For whatever type of stream you're sending, make sure it's relevant. Just stay away from no reply. As far as images go, make sure there's a good ratio of image to text. A common tactic of spammers is to use, just images. They'll have everything, all the data that they want to show to the user compiled into an image, and that's all that's really in the message. Maybe like an unsubscribe link or at the bottom or something like that. But you want to have a good ratio. It looks more personable to, filtering systems, which is what your kind of goal is to not necessarily beat the filtering systems, but just do what they want. And they're looking for well-weighted messages that include text, not just an image. Words and symbols. This one seems kind of obvious, but going through Mailgun logs like I do quite frequently, I'll see words that just don't believe or don't belong in a message. Free. I mean, free kind of can be used sometimes, but what I recommend is giving a subject line that's clear and simple, like a simple message, and show the content, make the content of the actual message something that is beneficial, that will get the customer through to your website. That's where you can show everything, but don't use exclamation points, dollar signs, obviously words like Viagra. Obviously, you wouldn't ever want to send to or send with. Reason for a lot of these words and symbols is Spam Assassin, or one of the popular services. They have rules set up for certain words like these, that if a message contains one of these words, it negatively impacts the delivery. So it's really important to write like a human, write like you're sending to your mom or colleague. HTML and text, always include an HTML and a text version of your message. This is important because Older mail clients will oftentimes not even be able to display HTML. I know it sounds kind of funny in this day and age, but there are still mail clients that do that. So if you don't have a text version, then there's nothing that the recipient can view, and it is something that it's always been a best practice, and something that we definitely continue to recommend. Interactions and clicks. This is kind of what I was talking to with that question I believe Mac had earlier with the click-through rate. Make a button that looks, that stands out to the customer. Accept an invitation, read online like the examples you see here. Give them something, a free copy of an ebook or something that, really kind of entices the customer to click through and actually get whatever you're trying to, if it's free, just give them something that they want to interact with. Don't send an email that doesn't have really any kind of call to actions, because you'll never get clicks. If there's not much for them to do on the email, they might just move on to the next one. In terms of unsubscribe links, obviously these are required, according to CAN-SPAM and our AUP. You have to include an unsubscribe link in messages. Make it clear. Don't hide it, in the smallest text on your email at the very bottom. Make it clear. I even recommend sometimes, users put it at the top of their message. You want users to unsubscribe. As funny as that sounds, you want a user to unsubscribe, because if they are considering, marking a message as spam, they will. But if you give them an unsubscribe link that's clear and concise, then they'll do that instead, and that won't impact your reputation like a complaint will. Chances are you have a lot of data about, your customers. So personalize the messages that you're sending to them. Always greet them, with a friendly, hi, Nick, with whatever their first name is. You have that data, so use it. This is important because, anytime you send, regular communication to a colleague or friend, you're always going to, greet them and say, hi, Nick, or hi, Bob, or whoever it is. So use that in your message. Chances are you have data around what their browsing habits are. Give them something that they want. Don't just send, the same generic copy to all of your users, because that doesn't show value to them. That's something that's really important. You want customers to, actually make it through to your website. So give them something that they want. Something that I say all the time, keep it simple, stupid. The KISS acronym. Yeah, keep it simple. I've seen messages that are extremely long. Everyone's trying to pack as much information into the messages as possible. Unfortunately, some mailbox providers will clip the message, like the image to the right. That's Gmail clipping the message because it's just got too much in it. Something else that happens, if that happens, we're unable to track opens because the open tracking pixel is clipped. So, it's really important. Keep it simple. If you have a lot of information to give to the customer, put it on your website and have a call to action that gets them through. It's always important. You don't want to kind of overwhelm the customer. Give them a couple links, and if there's more information, give them links on the landing page. Ben had a good question. Is it better to delete users permanently or keep them in your account but not email them? I would recommend, if it's a user that you've deleted for a reason or remove them from your list for a reason like unengagement, just get them out. Like, you don't need them in your system at all, to be perfectly honest. Because things happen, maybe you have a suppression list that you keep all these old inactive users and you accidentally send to it. I hear those stories, quite frequently, to be honest. Tyler asks, kind of on the list hygiene side of things, if you haven't scrubbed your list in a while, what's the best way to get started? In terms of Mailgun, we have our events API. It will, track all of your opens and clicks, so you'll have a good idea of your engaged users. Something else that you can do, you can use our email validation API. I know when I talked about it earlier was, using it for integrating with your sign-up forms, but you can also use our API to go through a list. So that's something that if you're interested in, take a look at our docs. We have a section on our email validation API and how to use it. Something that would be really helpful. Kind of get some of those, maybe bad addresses in your list out. Suzanne asked, what about all text emails? Is that better than all images? Yeah, absolutely. If you think about it, whenever you send a message to your friend, you just have a question for them, that's only going to be in text, right? So that's, personal communication. It's encouraging interaction. It's definitely better. Sometimes with images, maybe you're hosting that image on a service that maybe has been red flagged by a mailbox provider. So text only versus image only is definitely recommended. If you don't want to use images, that's fine. A lot of times users want to see something pretty. That's just human nature. So, that's not a bad idea. What's a good image ratio? I've heard different things. It's really, some people say 20/80, 30/70. I really don't think it's necessarily a set number. I like to always just say, 50/50. The important part is that you're getting both in there, and it's not just one or the other, or actually not just images. Like I just mentioned, text only is fine. Tim asks, what are best practices for news organizations that send daily emails but can't really give offers for re-engagement? That's a good question. Since you don't really have something that you can offer them or entice them with, a re-engagement campaign doesn't necessarily have to have an offer. It can be something just friendly, like, hey, we noticed you haven't been engaging with our emails recently. Do you still want to receive them? Anything like that where you're just trying to do one last effort to get in touch with them is something that I recommend. And if you don't get any response, then unfortunately it might be time to remove that user. Rolando asks, good question. Is the unsubscribe link required for all types of emails? How about registration, confirmation emails, non-transactional emails, and so on? No, you're right. According to CanSpan, unsubscribe links aren't required in transactional messages. So it is not completely necessary to include those. All right, looks like that's all the questions for that topic. So let's move on to monitoring your reputation. There's a lot of tools out there, but I think the best way to monitor things is just using, logs, using Mailgun logs, using Ongage logs, actually looking at analytics and seeing what's going on with your actual data that's being sent out. You can look to see, it's pretty obvious if you're having a lot of failures. You'll see spikes in failures, spikes in complaints, spikes in unsubscribes, things of that nature. So just always kind of keep an eye on logs. Mailgun's recently really revamped the analytics side of things. So take a look there if you haven't already, and you'll see that there's quite a bit of good data that you can use just from the data that you're sending. In terms of available resources, there's quite a few. Ones I want to touch on. Is Google Postmaster Tools, number one. Gmail makes up, roughly probably 50% of most customers' email lists. So, being that it's so heavily weighted, you need to keep an eye on Google specifically. So they offer Google Postmaster Tools. You can track your domain reputation, your IP reputation, and a host of other things like, how your messages are being authenticated and, spam activity. Talos, you may still know them as Cinder-based from Cisco. They recently changed over to Talos. That's another good service where you can check in on the reputation, how they're perceiving your IP and domain. So if you see that they say poor for your reputation, then it's something that you should probably audit and look into seeing what might have caused that dip. CinderScore everyone uses. We use it here. It's a good way to get a quick glimpse at the IP that you're using. If you're using a shared IP on Mailgun, it might be influenced by other senders. If you're using a dedicated, that's kind of a good representation of how your traffic's being seen by mailbox providers. What it does is give you a scale of 1 to 100. So you want to keep that CinderScore as close to that as possible. If you sign up for an account there at CinderScore, they also provide things like messages filtered, Cinder rejected, and a few other kind of metrics that you can kind of get a good idea of how your IP is being perceived. While there's not many, there are some services that allow for whitelisting. AOL is probably the biggest one that has a actual whitelist request that you can put in. The important thing to note here, though, is that they have to see traffic from your IP. So if you're using a dedicated IP, you can't expect to just put a whitelist request in right off the bat. You're going to have to start sending, and after a few days, put that request in, and they'll monitor traffic. If they like the traffic, if it looks okay to them, then they'll whitelist your IP, and that will help with a lot of the delivery failures, throttling, et cetera, that you'll see with AOL and now Verizon. Yahoo offers a bulk sender form that you can fill out. If you're struggling with Yahoo, if you're seeing deferrals, anything like that, they have a form that you can go through, sign up, and they'll look and review the traffic that's coming from that IP. And if what they're seeing is okay, then they can make adjustments to the IPs. So it's something that's good to keep an eye on. There are some other smaller services that offer whitelisting, but I just wanted to kind of touch on these two to start. Brian asks, does Mailgun like test messages? Rackspace hosting shows 463 IPs. How can we make certain that those do not impact our dedicated IP reputation? 463 blacklisted IPs he's talking about. Google Postmaster Tools, is it better to use text or CNAME record? So a few different questions there from Brian. In terms of Google Postmaster Tools, I don't think it really matters which one you use, text or CNAME. They're both there just for verification purposes, so Google can be sure the person submitting that information actually owns the domain. All right, not seeing any other questions regarding that topic, so we're going to move on to the next section. In terms of blacklists, that feeling you get when someone mentions blacklist, Grumpy Cat doesn't look too happy right there. Blacklists are a necessary evil, unfortunately. That said, there's a few that actually matter more than others. Spam House, for example, that's the big one. That's the big dog on the food chain. You don't want to be listed there. If you do get listed there by chance, then you will see delivery failures, especially to Yahoo and Microsoft. That speaks highly to Spam House whenever legitimate mailbox providers like Yahoo and Microsoft are actually using their services. Google doesn't use them because they have all these very sophisticated algorithms set up, and they can get a good idea of what's good and what's not without it. Spam Cop's another good one. It determines the origin of unwanted emails based on reports from users of that service. So if someone that's using Spam Cop on their mailbox decides they didn't like a message, they can report it to Spam Cop. Spam Cop also does have traps, spam traps that they have set up, so you can get listed there because of that as well. Barracuda is more important for those that are sending B2B messaging. Barracuda is something that businesses can set on their servers to monitor for. So if you're sending to businesses, Barracuda is something that you should kind of closely monitor. If you get listed there, chances are it's very popular by businesses. You might have delivery problems. Evaluate is another one that I kind of look at, and we do here at Mailgun. Really, one of the things that we look at in determining impact of blacklist is actually looking at logs and seeing whenever IPs are listed, seeing if we're seeing failures. If we're seeing failures, then obviously means that it's a reputable blacklist. There's some out there where you can be listed and it doesn't impact you at all, which we'll kind of touch on the next slide. There are, like I said, less reputable, but this doesn't mean don't check them. These are really, really good data points. Sorbs lists a lot of IPs, and you might see your IP turn up on their list from time to time. Through research, chances are you've sent to one of their traps. So if you are sending to maybe a Sorbs trap or a Nick spam trap or UC Protect network trap, then there's things that you can clean up on your side. It won't necessarily impact your delivery very much. We say this because we've looked through millions of lines of logs for IPs that are listed by these services. It doesn't necessarily, like I said, mean just ignore them. It doesn't mean that in any way. It just means it's not going to impact you like others. Thomas asks, what is your experience with list unsubscribe through a header? Do customers tend to unsubscribe more whenever you include that header? That's a very good question again, Thomas. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, I think there are studies that show, whenever, that header is added, there might be a rise in unsubscribes. Kind of what I wanted to touch on, or what I touched on earlier, was that unsubscribes aren't a bad thing. If there's users that just, unfortunately don't want to receive your messages anymore, you want them to unsubscribe, because if they don't, chances are they might complain, and that's what you want to kind of stay away from. But yeah, adding that header, you may see a slight increase in unsubscribes. That's not something I would be worried about. That kind of actually leads us to the end of our presentation. We have these contact addresses here for both Ongage and Mailgun. If y'all have any questions, feel free to reach out to them.
All right, so I guess we can call it a wrap. Again, thanks everybody for joining us, and have a great rest of the week. Thanks again, Nick. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.